It was supposed to be just another morning. A respected judge. A quiet rest stop. A suit, a car, and a calm demeanor. But within minutes, none of that mattered. Because for two officers, what they saw was not a man, but a threat. What happened next would shake a police department, go viral across the country, and ignite a conversation far deeper than a single arrest. This is the true story of Judge Malcolm Reyes. The man who went from being cuffed to presiding over the hearing of the very officers who arrested him. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when Judge Malcolm Reyes pulled his jet-black Mercedes into the modest rest stop off Interstate 80, somewhere west of Newport, Illinois. The sun, half hidden behind veils of cloud, cast a muted glow over the dew-slick asphalt. He wasn't in a rush. In fact, the peaceful stretch of road had offered a welcome pause before what promised to be a full, consequential day. His destination, a high-level justice reform roundtable at the Capitol, hosted by the governor himself. His mission, to lend decades of wisdom to the ongoing battle for a fairer legal system. Dressed in a tailored slate-gray suit, a pale blue dress shirt, and a subtle silk tie, Malcolm looked exactly as he was, an experienced judge, confident yet unpretentious. His presence was quiet, refined. In the seat beside him lay a slim, elegant leather portfolio containing notes, talking points, and legal recommendations, painstakingly prepared. He sipped from a travel mug, glanced once more at the route on his phone, and allowed himself a moment of calm. That peace shattered the moment red and blue lights flickered into his rearview mirror. A state trooper cruiser had pulled in behind him with unexpected urgency. Malcolm froze, not in panic, but in sharp awareness. He recognized the sensation well. The tightening chest. The sharpened breath. The narrowing of time and space. It was a feeling he had heard described by countless men, young, old, guilty, innocent, standing before his bench. Men who spoke of the shift that happens when you stop being seen as a person and become, instead, a profile. Malcolm had believed he'd moved beyond that. Age. Success. A judicial robe. Surely those things had earned him a kind of protection. But the light said otherwise. He lowered his window smoothly and placed both hands visibly atop the steering wheel, deliberate, careful. Every motion a preemptive answer to a question not yet asked. As the officer approached, Malcolm kept his tone calm, measured. "Good morning, officer. Is everything all right?" There was no greeting in return. The officer, Daniels, the nameplate read, offered no acknowledgement of civility. He looked Malcolm up and down, scanning not the man but the image, a black man alone, in a luxury vehicle, in a remote rest stop. Suspicion was already blooming behind his eyes. His voice, when it came, was clipped and devoid of curiosity. "We received a report of a stolen vehicle matching this description," he said flatly. "Seen leaving a gas station not far from here." Malcolm blinked, caught off guard not by the accusation, but by the unmistakable routine of it, the way the words came not as a question, but a script. He responded, as any innocent man would, with composure. "I'm not aware of any report like that," he said. "I've just stopped here briefly before heading to a meeting. I can provide my registration if you'd like." But Officer Daniels was not interested in registration. He didn't ask for license or ID. Instead, he took a half-step back and placed his hand casually, menacingly, on his holstered weapon. "Step out of the vehicle. Now." A breath caught in Malcolm's throat. Not from fear, he had long trained that instinct into stillness, but from the quiet violence of it all. The erasure of his identity, the assumption of guilt, the sudden transformation from citizen to suspect. And yet, he moved. Slowly. Intentionally. He opened the car door and stepped out, his 6-foot frame unfolding like a calm refusal to be diminished. His posture was dignified, not defiant. His expression unreadable, his heart steady. This was not new. This was inherited, passed down through generations of silent endurance. By the time the second officer, Green, arrived, the performance of suspicion had escalated. Malcolm stood at the rear of his car, hands in the air, coat unbuttoned. He asked, still in that composed tone, "I'd like to know what I'm being accused of." There was no answer. What followed was the unraveling of dignity by degrees. Officer Daniels circled the vehicle, opened the driver's door without consent, and began rummaging through Malcolm's belongings. Malcolm took a measured step forward. "Officer, I do not consent to a search of my vehicle." That sentence, lawful, restrained, correct, was all it took. "You're obstructing," Daniels snapped. "That's interference." Before Malcolm could reply, the officer seized his arm, twisted it behind his back, and clamped on a cold steel cuff. Officer Green, silent and uneasy, secured the other wrist. There was no struggle. No shouting. Malcolm's voice was low but firm as he said, "You're making a serious mistake." And still, the world kept turning. Across the parking lot, a few travelers looked on. One, a college student on spring break, had already begun filming on her phone. Another, a retired Army veteran sipping from a gas station coffee cup, muttered, "That man doesn't look like someone who stole anything." But the officers didn't look up. They didn't see the well-shined shoes, the courtly bearing, the years of service etched into Malcolm's quiet gaze. They saw only what they were conditioned to suspect, a silhouette, a stereotype, a story that required no facts. As Malcolm was walked to the patrol car, cuffed but unbroken, he didn't resist. His chin remained lifted, not in arrogance, but in disbelief. Not because he was above the law, but because he had spent his life defending its ideals. And in that moment, those ideals were failing him. Quietly. Brutally. Systemically. He sat in the back of the cruiser and said nothing. His eyes drifted past the glass, toward the trees beyond the highway. He wasn't angry. Not yet. He wasn't humiliated. He was calculating. Remembering. Because he knew something they didn't. This wouldn't end the way they thought it would. The holding room was cold, not from temperature, but from the kind of detachment that only exists in spaces where power is wielded without question and silence is used as a weapon. Judge Malcolm Reyes sat perfectly still in a plastic chair bolted to the floor, his back straight, his hands resting quietly on his knees. The handcuffs had been removed, but the skin around his wrist still bore their memory, two raw impressions, red and silent. He hadn't been offered water. He hadn't been asked if he needed anything. No one had told him why he was being held, or for how long. And yet, he had asked. Politely. 3 times. Each request was met with either a vague shrug or averted eyes, like a system pretending not to recognize the man it was detaining. No one said the words aloud, but the message was clear. You may not be who you say you are. And even if you are, you're not one of us. Malcolm breathed in slowly, controlled, as he'd done thousands of times before, on the bench, during trial, while hearing the pleas of young men who had never been given the grace of patience. He was not new to injustice. He had studied it. Fought it. Lived alongside it. But rarely had he felt it settle so heavily on his own shoulders, pressing down not as a single moment of offense, but as a weight carried through centuries of assumption and fear. Outside the glass, the precinct moved on. Phones rang. Radios buzzed. Keys jangled on hips. Paperwork shifted from one desk to another. The mundane rhythm of state authority ticked by, uninterrupted. And yet, there was a strange tension in the air, like static before a lightning strike. Officers glanced at him as they passed, some with curiosity, some with visible disdain, a few with smirks that barely concealed their disbelief. He didn't belong here. That much was obvious. But no one dared say it aloud. Officer Daniels, the arresting officer, passed through the hallway twice. The second time, he paused. He leaned against the doorframe with his arms folded, watching Malcolm through the thick glass. There was something in his expression, a mix of irritation and confusion. As if Malcolm's presence now represented an inconvenient question he hadn't prepared to answer. "You gonna tell us what you were really doing back there?" Daniels muttered the first time, just loud enough to be heard, just low enough to avoid accountability. "Casing the area. Waiting for someone." Malcolm turned his head slowly toward him. His eyes calm, unwavering. "I was reviewing directions on my phone," he replied. "For a meeting in Newport." Daniels scoffed. "Right. You people always got a story." The phrase lingered in the air like a bad taste. "You people." The words weren't new to Malcolm. He had heard them before, in testimonies, in police reports, in cross-examinations disguised as casual inquiries. Always, they carried the same acid. The same refusal to see the full humanity of the person they were directed at. Officer Green, who had assisted in the arrest, stood further back, quiet. She hadn't said a word since they'd entered the precinct. Her shoulders were hunched. Her eyes stayed low. She hadn't looked at Malcolm once since removing the cuffs. Perhaps it was shame. Or fear. Or the realization that she had stepped into something larger than she could control. Whatever it was, she stayed silent, as if her voice would betray her more than her actions already had. Malcolm didn't respond to Danielle's baiting. He wasn't there to educate him. He wasn't there to fight for recognition. He was there, for now, as an observer. Watching the way injustice slithered through routine. How it clothed itself in policies and paperwork, in smirks and indifference. How it turned even moments of profound error into mundane procedure. He had once presided over a trial in which a 17-year-old boy had been arrested for loitering. The boy had been walking home from work. Nothing more. When Malcolm asked the arresting officer what had made the teen suspicious, the answer had been, "He looked like he didn't belong." Malcolm remembered the way that phrase had landed in the courtroom. He remembered the silence that followed it. Now, seated in a holding cell under fluorescent lights, he felt it again, this time inside his own bones. It had been almost 2 hours. Still no phone call. Still no name recognition. Still no acknowledgement of error. Then, without warning, a shift. The door to the precinct opened with a firm thud. Boots clicked briskly against the tile. A woman's voice, low, measured, purposeful, cut through the haze. "How long has he been here?" It was Sergeant Maria Alvarez, mid-50s, posture like a steel beam, her hair pinned in a no-nonsense bun. She had a presence that required no volume. No theatrics. Just presence. The room instinctively straightened around her. Someone at a desk answered hesitantly. "A little under 2 hours. Obstruction. Vehicle match." Alvarez turned toward the glass, her gaze landing on Malcolm. She paused. Took him in. The clothes. The composure. The silence. Something didn't add up, and she could feel it. She stepped into the holding area. "Sir, have you been advised of your rights?" she asked, her tone professional, but less detached than the others. "Yes, ma'am," Malcolm said. "But I have not been permitted to contact my office. I've made multiple requests." She narrowed her eyes, not in suspicion, but in assessment. His voice was precise. Formal. Unshaken. It was the voice of someone who had given orders, not just followed them. "What's your name again?" she asked. "Malcolm Reyes," he said simply. "And I recommend someone verify that name, before this becomes something irreversible." From behind her, Daniels let out a dry laugh. "He's been playing the important man act since we brought him in." Alvarez turned on him sharply. "That's enough." She returned her attention to Malcolm, then turned and strode to the nearest computer terminal. Her fingers typed quickly. Malcolm didn't move. He didn't need to. He already knew what she would find. And when she did, the room would shift. Because the man they had profiled, handcuffed, and silenced wasn't just another black man at a rest stop. He was Judge Malcolm L. Reyes, presiding judge of the 14th District Court of the state of Illinois. And the truth was coming. Not with fanfare. Not with fury. But with the quiet, unmistakable weight of justice correcting its course. Truth rarely arrives with fanfare. It doesn't announce itself with sirens or speeches. It simply reveals. Quietly. Irrefutably. And when it does, there's no rewinding the moment. Inside the Jefferson County precinct, that moment arrived in the click of a keyboard. Sergeant Maria Alvarez stared at her computer screen, blinking once, then again, as if clarity required more than sight. She had expected a clean report, maybe a minor traffic infraction, something that would explain the man's poise, his deliberate tone, his quiet defiance. But what loaded was a profile that read like a resume of consequence. Judge Malcolm L. Reyes. Harvard Law. Former federal prosecutor. 15 years on the bench. Special advisor to the state judiciary on constitutional policing and community trust initiatives. Her breath caught, not out of shock, but realization. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a rupture in the system. One that could no longer be ignored. She looked up, through the glass of the holding area, at the man who had sat in stillness for nearly 2 hours, hands cuffed earlier without charge, denied his calls, watched like a threat. He hadn't protested. Hadn't pleaded. He had waited. Not for mercy. For justice to remember itself. With her jaw set, Alvarez turned on her heel and strode into the holding area. Officers Daniels and Green, she said, her tone clipped, professional, but carrying something sharper beneath. Inside. Now. They followed, still unaware of what storm was brewing behind her composed expression. Malcolm Reyes looked up. His gaze met hers, not challengingly, but with the solemn weight of someone who had lived this scene before, in other lives, in other forms. And yet, this was new. Because this time, he was not a witness. He was the subject. Alvarez's voice broke the air. "You said you had a meeting in Newport," she asked quietly. Malcolm nodded. "Yes. At noon. I was invited to speak at the governor's roundtable on justice reform." A pause. Then. "And you are Judge Malcolm Reyes?" "Yes." In that moment, time seemed to stall. Even the fluorescent lights above them seemed to flicker in recognition. From behind Alvarez, Daniel straightened, his mouth parting in disbelief. "Wait, what do you mean, Judge?" Alvarez turned her head slowly, her eyes narrowing, not with fury, but with a deeper kind of disappointment. "You arrested a sitting judge," she said coldly. "Without cause. You searched his vehicle without a warrant. You denied him his legal rights. And you never once ran his name through the system." Daniels tried to gather himself. "He didn't say he was." "You had his ID," she snapped, voice rising for the first time. "It was your job to verify it. Instead, you escalated without reason. You profiled him. You humiliated him. You compromised the entire department." Next to him, Officer Green looked as though she might be sick. Her face had drained of color. Her lips moved, but no sound came. She was unraveling, not from exposure, but from recognition. She had known, somewhere deep down, from the moment they cuffed him, that this wasn't right. She just hadn't stopped it. Alvarez turned back to Malcolm, her voice now formal, reverent. "Your Honor, would you like us to contact the governor's office or have someone drive you?" Malcolm stood slowly. His back straightened not from pride, but from principle. "Yes," he said simply. "Thank you." The walk out of the precinct was silent. But every step echoed. Desks paused mid-conversation. Phones hung in midair. Officers who had glanced at him hours earlier with suspicion now watched him with unease, some even awe. The man they had assumed was just another case was moving through their house, not as a victim, but as a symbol of something undeniable. A reckoning had begun. By the time Judge Reyes arrived at the Capitol, the first video was already making its rounds. A 27-second clip, recorded at the rest stop by a college student on spring break, captured him being handcuffed, arms behind his back, calmly asking, "What am I being accused of?" The student's voice, barely audible, could be heard in the background. "He didn't do anything. This is insane." Within 4 hours, the video had 500,000 views. By nightfall, over 2 million. Hashtags erupted. Hashtag judged before justice. Hashtag justice for Reyes. Hashtag dignity in cuffs. Hashtag stop the profile. News anchors described the event as a defining moment in the national conversation on race and policing. Screens across the country flashed Malcolm's judicial profile beside freeze frames of his arrest. The contrast was too sharp to ignore. Too clean. Too powerful. A man who had devoted decades to upholding the law, stripped of his dignity by those sworn to enforce it. Civil rights leaders issued statements. Politicians scrambled. The governor's office confirmed Judge Reyes's scheduled appearance and promised a full review of the incident. Protesters gathered outside the Jefferson precinct by morning, holding signs. He had the badge. They had the power. The law isn't blind. It's just selective. Inside the precinct, everything had changed. The smug laughter was gone. So were the casual jokes and dismissals. Officer Daniels was pulled into a disciplinary review before lunch. Officer Green remained silent, haunted. Sergeant Alvarez coordinated with Internal Affairs, the State Attorney General, and External Counsel. The incident had crossed the line from mistake to moment. Officers gathered in small clusters, whispering. Younger cadets looked nervous. Some even hopeful. Because for the first time in recent memory, the system wasn't just catching a bad actor, it was turning the mirror on itself. And it didn't like what it saw. Malcolm said nothing to the press that day. He didn't need to. The truth had already spoken louder than any microphone. But inside the governor's rotunda, when he sat down at the round table, flanked by lawmakers and legal advisors, something remarkable happened. Everyone stood. Not out of protocol, but out of respect. He gave a short nod, opened his portfolio, and said quietly, "Yesterday, on my way to this very meeting, I was detained without cause, handcuffed, and denied access to legal counsel. I do not believe that happened because of my actions. I believe it happened because of my appearance. I am not the first this has happened to. And unless we act, I will not be the last." The room was silent. Some blinked back tears. Others clenched jaws. Because now, it wasn't just a reform meeting. It was a reckoning. And justice, at long last, was being seen not as an ideal, but as a standard that even its enforcers would have to answer to. The sun rose over the state like it always did, indifferent, golden, and slow, but the people were different. That morning, something had changed. In courtrooms, coffee shops, classrooms, and precincts across the country, the video was playing on loop. A black man in a tailored suit, hands cuffed behind his back, calmly asking, "What am I being accused of?" as two white officers held him like a fugitive. What the world saw next was the shift, when they learned that man was Judge Malcolm Reyes, a pillar of the judicial system, a scholar of law and ethics, and an advisor on constitutional justice. He wasn't just anybody. And yet, he had been treated like he was nobody. It was the quiet that shocked people most. Not the violence, but its absence. No yelling. No flailing. No threats. Just a man too familiar with injustice to be surprised by it. A governor's reckoning. By midday, the media had reached a fever pitch. Journalists from CNN to NPR to local affiliate stations gathered like a storm front outside the state capitol. Press passes flashed. Tripods filled the marble corridor. But none of them were the main event. That role belonged to one man. Malcolm Reyes, standing just off stage in a navy suit, holding the same worn leather portfolio he had carried the day he was arrested. It wasn't a prop. It was a promise. Inside were notes, not on retaliation, but on reform. At precisely noon, Governor Elise Maddox stepped up to the podium, her expression a careful balance of remorse and responsibility. Her first words weren't political. They were personal. We owe Judge Reyes not only an apology, but an answer. She paused. Cameras clicked. But she didn't flinch. This was not a simple error. This was a reflection of a system that too often sees threat instead of person, suspicion instead of story. We cannot claim to care about justice if we do not acknowledge when we get it wrong. Behind her, Malcolm stood still, his presence like gravity, pulling attention not through force, but truth. The governor turned toward him and gestured to the microphone. He stepped forward. A voice measured like verdict. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't shuffle papers. He simply began. I was arrested not because I broke the law, but because I fit a story someone else wrote in their mind. I wore the wrong skin in the right car. Silence fell like a velvet curtain. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't resist. And still, I was treated like I had something to hide. But what I hid, what they didn't know, was that I was a judge. That I've spent decades upholding the very system that failed to uphold me. He looked out across the room, his voice never rising. I'm not here to ask for punishment. I'm here to ask for clarity. What happened to me happens to others, but they don't always have a badge, a title, or a camera. What does that mean for them? An apology is a start. But the apology must echo, in how we train, how we hire, how we hold each other accountable. Otherwise, it's just a headline. He stepped back. The room did not clap. It listened. And that was louder than applause. Behind closed doors, the hearing. Later that week, inside a private chamber at the State Ethics Tribunal, Officers Daniels and Green sat across from a three-judge panel. Malcolm Reyes was one of them, not as a plaintiff, but as a peer. Daniels, once loud, was now pale and silent. Green, visibly shaken, fidgeted with her uniform sleeve. Witnesses were called. The student who had filmed the video testified over Zoom. He was just sitting there. I didn't start recording because I thought he was a judge. I started because it felt wrong. Legal analysts dissected department procedures. Civil rights lawyers cited case law. The room was clinical, yes, but what radiated between its walls was not policy. It was something more human. Truth. When it was his turn to speak, Judge Reyes kept his words brief. This review is not about me. It's about conduct. And whether that conduct aligns with the values this badge is meant to represent. By day's end, the ruling was clear. Officer Daniels was found guilty of unlawful detainment, unjustified search, and use of authority without cause. Officer Green, though less involved, was charged with failure to intervene and complicity through inaction. Both were suspended without pay and placed under formal investigation by Internal Affairs. It wasn't enough for some. It was too much for others. But for Reyes, it was a beginning. The public pulse. Outside the tribunal, hundreds had gathered. Not to chant. Not to rage. But to watch. They stood with signs. The law must see us. Dignity is not a crime. He stayed calm, so we wouldn't have to. There was no celebration as Daniels and Green exited the building under escort. No jeers. No applause. Just a silence so dense it echoed. A kind of public verdict. One woman whispered to her son, that's what accountability looks like. The echo. In the weeks that followed, departments statewide began to shift. Slowly. Quietly. But undeniably. Bias training was updated. Body cam reviews became standard. Hiring boards began consulting community leaders. And most importantly, internal complaints from civilians were no longer ignored. But Malcolm Reyes did not return to the spotlight. He returned to court. He presided as he always had, measured, fair, firm. He never referenced the incident. Never gave it away in a look or a tone. But those who stood before him knew. The attorneys. The officers. The defendants. They stood straighter. They listened longer. Because he had become more than a judge. He had become a standard. One more step forward. 3 months later, he stood at a podium again, this time not for cameras, but for cadets. Young recruits in uniform. The future of law enforcement. The academy's director introduced him with reverence. Reyes didn't say much. Just this. You will wear the uniform. You will carry the power. But your greatest weapon is neither badge nor baton, it is discernment. Learn the difference between suspicion and prejudice. Learn it early. Learn it deeply. Because when you put someone in handcuffs, you're not just arresting a body. You're touching their dignity. And you better be sure the law, not your fear, put you there. The cadets didn't clap. They nodded. And that was enough. As Malcolm stepped down from the stage, a young officer whispered, not loudly enough for others to hear, "You're why I joined." He didn't respond. He just gave the young man a nod. The apology had been spoken. The echo was moving forward. And in its quiet wake, the system had begun, at last, to listen. It began the way many monumental things do, quietly. A college sophomore, parked across the lot during a coffee break at a rural Michigan rest stop, noticed something unusual: 2 white state troopers pulling a black man in a business suit out of a Lincoln Continental. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his position. All she knew was something didn't feel right. So she did what her generation had learned to do. She pulled out her phone and hit record. What she captured, those 27 seconds of blurry, handheld footage, would shatter the glass walls of indifference that often protect institutions from scrutiny. It wasn't violent. It wasn't even loud. But it didn't need to be. Because in the quiet stillness of the video, truth screamed. What the world saw. The clip opens with a man, tall and composed, standing beside a car, hands cuffed behind his back. His suit jacket hangs neatly from his shoulders. His face is calm, not blank, not cold, but dignified in a way that unsettled even the viewer. He speaks, but not to the camera. His eyes never glance toward the lens. He speaks to the officer restraining him. "I'd like to know what I'm being accused of." His voice is controlled. His breath steady. He doesn't plead. He simply asks, and in that ask, the entire weight of history trembles. Behind the camera, the girl whispers. "This is insane. He didn't do anything." The camera shakes slightly. A moment later, the officer, Jeffers, pats down the man, rougher than necessary, as if trying to erase something he couldn't explain. End of clip. No climax. No resolution. Just dignity in cuffs. The spread. She uploaded the video with a caption born of shock and instinct. "Arrested for being black in a suit." It went viral within hours. First TikTok. Then Instagram. Then Twitter, Reddit, YouTube. People began reposting, reacting, narrating, translating, debating. In less than 12 hours, the video had reached over 1 million views. By midnight, it had passed 2 million and sparked threads titled, "Why didn't he resist? He's too calm, that's fear. What if he were your father?" But the tidal wave came when a user commented beneath the post. "Wait. That's Judge Malcolm Reyes. I interned in his courtroom last year." Another chimed in with a LinkedIn screenshot of Judge Reyes's profile, confirming that the man in the video was no random passerby, no anonymous traveler. He was a senior district judge. A man who had spent 2 decades upholding the very system that had just handcuffed him without cause. Shock turns to outrage. That revelation, who he was, became the accelerant. Newsrooms scrambled to verify. Major networks led with it that night. Legal experts were invited onto morning shows. Civil rights leaders began referencing the video in press conferences. Celebrities retweeted it with captions like, "This is why we march. This is America, still. Respectable doesn't mean protected." And yet, for many in the black community, this wasn't shocking at all. If anything, it was painfully familiar. They had warned of this kind of profiling for generations. The only difference was that this time, the man had a title that forced the world to listen. Dignity as defiance. What haunted viewers most wasn't the arrest. It was the way he stood. The way he looked at his arresters. The way he asked a question, without shouting, without rage, as though he'd seen this scene play out before, only this time, he was in the starring role. That composure became a symbol. Not of passivity, but of defiant clarity. A still man in motionless protest. The ripples across the nation. In homes, families watched together. Children asked their parents what it meant. In precincts, officers stared at the screen in tense silence. Some turned it off halfway through. Others watched again. In courtrooms, judges who once shared handshakes with Malcolm Reyes now whispered each other's names in disbelief. And in schools, the video became part of lesson plans. Teachers used it to open discussions about race, justice, and assumptions. From viral to verified. By the next morning, media outlets had confirmed not only the man's identity, but the fact that he had been unlawfully detained for over 2 hours without a phone call, denied access to legal counsel, and falsely accused of driving a stolen car, despite having shown registration and ID. What's worse? That ID clearly read, Judge Malcolm Reyes, State of Michigan, 14th District Court. And still, no one had verified it. Because to those officers, the badge he carried in his wallet mattered less than the color of the skin holding it. Echoes in power. In response to mounting public pressure, the governor's office released a statement acknowledging grave concerns and promising a full investigation. The Department of Justice began probing systemic patterns in the state police. Lawmakers introduced emergency bias training bills. Civil rights organizations organized legal clinics for those with similar stories who never had a camera watching. But through all this, Malcolm Reyes himself remained quiet. He did not post online. He did not seek interviews. He did not attend protests. He returned to the courtroom. And that restraint only deepened the public respect for him. Because the world was screaming his name, and still, he chose to stand in the same silence that first shook the nation. Legacy in motion. By week's end, the clip had reached 30 million views across platforms. Universities were requesting permission to use it in criminal justice curriculum. Documentarians called it the moment the robe got handcuffed. And in precincts across the country, a quiet chill ran through departments. Because this time, the story didn't fade. It grew. It questioned. It demanded. A new conversation begins. What started as a 27-second clip became something larger. A mirror for law enforcement. A mandate for elected officials. A message to citizens. The message? That no amount of respectability protects you in a system untrained to see your humanity. And yet, that very humanity, silent, steady, unwavering, could still change everything. Because justice didn't yell that day. It stood still, in cuffs, and asked a question. And the world, for once, had no answer. Only the echo of a video that refused to go quiet. The walls of the Jackson State Police Precinct had never felt this quiet. Not after a high-speed chase. Not after a major bust. Not even after a shooting review board. But now, with no sirens wailing and no alarms blaring, the silence was profoundly louder, because it came from within. A reckoning had entered the building. Not through a lawsuit. Not through violence. But through truth, undeniable, public, and replayed millions of times across every screen in the country. And this time, the truth wore a badge of its own. A precinct under glass. Every officer in the precinct had seen the video. Some had watched it once, lips tightening, faces unreadable. Others had watched it over and over, trying to make sense of what couldn't be defended. There was no audio manipulation. No editing. No ambiguity. It was simple. 2 white officers. A black man. A routine stop. A full arrest. No justification. And then, the reveal. Not just a man. A judge. A veteran of justice. A pillar of the system they had sworn to uphold. The chasm between uniform and justice. What made this different wasn't the abuse of power. Sadly, that had precedence. It wasn't even the racial profiling, though that sat like a shadow in every line of dialogue from the officers. What made this moment reverberate through the walls of law enforcement was that Malcolm Reyes wasn't an outsider. He was one of their own, a man whose courtroom decisions had shaped policy, whose lectures had trained new prosecutors, whose rulings had been cited in officer training courses across the state. And still, that hadn't protected him. It should have been impossible. But it wasn't. And that realization spread like a slow poison across desks, behind doors, and through hallways that suddenly didn't feel so secure. Behind closed doors. In an internal conference room with shades drawn and tension visible, Officer Jeffers sat across from 2 members of Internal Affairs and the precinct's legal counsel. Gone was his confident swagger. The smirk that had once followed him into every interview was absent. His eyes darted, lips pressed tight, jaw set, not in defiance, but in denial. A man coming to terms with the gravity of his own assumptions. You never verified his ID. Why initiate a search without a warrant? Why was he cuffed when he complied fully? Jeffers shifted uncomfortably. He was evasive. And, sitting there like that. The car matched a report. It looked off. A pause followed. Do you hear yourself? Those words, said quietly by the lead investigator, lingered longer than any accusation. Because in them lay the root of the problem. It looked off. He looked wrong. Not because of what he did, but because of who he was, and more damningly, what Jeffers thought he wasn't supposed to be. The weight of complicity. In a separate room, Officer Green sat in near silence. She had said little during the arrest. She had followed commands. She had hesitated, yes, but still cuffed a man whose only offense was protecting his rights. Now, her silence was under review. Why didn't you speak up? Did you know who he was? Did you feel what was happening was wrong? Her voice cracked slightly when she finally answered. Yes. I mean, something felt wrong. But I didn't want to interfere. I didn't think I could. Her words were soft, but devastating. Because they captured something bigger than cowardice, they revealed the paralysis of a culture that punishes dissent and mistakes hesitation for betrayal. In that moment, Green wasn't just on trial. The system was. A different kind of authority. Outside those closed rooms, Sergeant Pamela Yates fielded calls from all angles, the governor's liaison, civil rights attorneys, media relations, internal review boards, the Attorney General's office. In a 24-hour span, her role had shifted from superior officer to crisis manager, from mentor to mediator, from authority to answerer. And she was tired. Not because of the noise. but because of the truth she couldn't escape. She had seen the look in Judge Reyes' eyes that morning. She had heard the calm in his voice. She had watched the footage 10 times now. Every time, it pierced deeper. Because she realized that in all her years of service, she had never once questioned how much of her trust was tied to appearance, to uniform, to badge, to skin. And now, her precinct was the epicenter of something that could no longer be rationalized or buried. A mirror that doesn't blink. That day, every officer, from rookies to veterans, was required to watch the video during a closed debrief. No commentary. No explanations. No skipping. They watched in rows, some leaning forward, others stiff in their seats. The room was filled not with noise, but with discomfort. With shame. With reflection. Some crossed their arms. Others swallowed hard. A few took notes, not because they had to, but because they wanted to remember what it felt like to see justice betrayed, from the inside. A shift begins. By sunset, the precinct looked the same. Same desks. Same badges. Same files. But something fundamental had changed. Training materials were being rewritten. A full audit of past arrests was underway. Bias intervention programs were ordered statewide. Officers spoke to each other differently, more measured, less automatic. A quiet awareness had settled in. This isn't just about one incident. It's about every moment that went unrecorded. Every man who didn't have a title. Every woman who didn't have a camera. Every child who learned that silence meant survival. A system faces itself. Justice, by design, is blind. But it cannot afford to be blind to itself. That day, the system didn't collapse. But it looked in the mirror. And it didn't like what it saw. Because beneath the policies, beneath the laws, beneath the procedures, there was something older and harder to dismantle. Assumption. And for once, for the first time in a long time, the badge didn't protect that. The reckoning had begun. Not in a courtroom. Not on a protest sign. But in the stillness between a judge's voice and a system's silence. And this time, justice wasn't passing sentence. It was sitting in it. The Michigan State Capitol stood regal beneath the pale morning light. Marble columns rose like sentinels, and the breeze carried the faint echo of traffic, media chatter, and something older, expectation. Inside, in the stately chambers of Room 312, usually reserved for long policy talks and dry budgetary debates, the air felt different. Tighter. More aware. Staffers whispered quietly into phones. Reporters clutched their notepads. Cameras adjusted their lenses, already trained on the empty chair at the head of the table. And for once, politics was not the story. Conscience was. The arrival. The doors opened exactly at 10 a.m. Judge Malcolm Reyes entered with a quiet confidence that didn't demand attention, it commanded it. He walked with steady steps, his crisp navy suit falling perfectly across his frame, the same leather portfolio from the arrest video tucked under his arm. His face bore no theatrical expression, but something deeper, gravitas worn into the skin. Every person in the room, from junior aides to the governor herself, stood, almost instinctively. Not because the rules of protocol required it. But because the moral compass inside them whispered that they should. Judge Reyes nodded respectfully, his eyes sweeping across the room without judgment. But the weight of his presence made every official, every lawmaker, every uniformed officer, sit up straighter. Because no one could forget what they had seen. Because everyone knew who he was now, not just his title, but his story. Breaking from the script. The governor began with welcoming remarks, her voice firm but reverent. She spoke of justice, timing, and how vital it was that the state listened, reflected, and grew. But before the planned agenda could begin, Judge Reyes raised a single hand, gently, not for control, but for space. The room fell silent. Then he spoke. Before we begin discussions on training, policy, and reform, allow me a few words. I believe they are necessary. There was no resistance. Just the kind of silence that makes people put down their pens and really, truly listen. Words that shift the ground. He didn't begin with accusations. He didn't ask for pity. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he began with a memory. Yesterday morning, I was detained and handcuffed by 2 officers of this state. I was not combative. I was not evasive. I was not charged. And yet, I was held, without cause, without contact, without dignity. No one interrupted. He placed the portfolio gently on the table and folded his hands. There was no warrant. No investigation. No verification of identity. Only suspicion, I believe, that had more to do with the color of my skin and the car I drove than with any crime. A low sigh escaped from somewhere in the back of the room. Another hand covered a mouth. A senator lowered her head. Judge Reyes continued, his voice gaining quiet momentum. Let me be clear, this is not new. It did not begin with me. And it will not end with me, unless we choose to end it. I have presided over thousands of cases. I've listened to young men recount stories like mine, often dismissed as exaggeration. I've watched lives spiral because we dismissed dignity as something conditional. As something earned. But it isn't. It never was. The words hung in the air like a stone placed on the chest. No longer just a meeting. What had been scheduled as a 90-minute roundtable on procedural policy was transforming in real time into a moment of reckoning. Policy documents were closed. Talking points were forgotten. Now, it was no longer about systems and statistics. It was about people. And one person in particular who had walked through the system with honor, only to be reduced to a threat in a roadside rest area. We speak of rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve, he said. But trust is not a request. It is an investment. And we cannot expect communities to trust the system until we make dignity a non-negotiable part of its foundation. The room responds. Some lawmakers nodded solemnly. Others wiped at the corners of their eyes, moved not just by the injustice but by the calm with which it was revealed. Even members of law enforcement in the room, trained to assess power, to resist vulnerability, leaned forward. One younger officer looked down, jaw clenched, as if weighing his entire future in that moment. And across the room, aides began whispering, not about politics, not about optics, but about change. The agenda, transformed. When Judge Reyes finished, he did not lean back triumphantly. He simply paused. And in that pause, the purpose of the meeting shifted. Instead of incremental adjustments to hiring standards and continuing education modules, the discussion turned toward real-time disciplinary reform, independent civilian review boards, immediate anti-bias retraining across precincts, retroactive audits of past arrests made under suspicion-only grounds. The governor leaned in again, but this time not to lead, but to listen. Judge Reyes had not just spoken. He had realigned the table around him. Legacy begins with listening. That afternoon, long after Judge Reyes had left the room, a draft bill began to form, one that would later bear his name. News outlets reported his remarks in full. Social media erupted with quotes. Students in law schools watched the full footage, discussing not just the incident, but the integrity with which it was met. And across the country, precincts began to rewatch the video, not as a scandal, but as a warning. Because what happened to Malcolm Reyes had shown them that no one is safe from prejudice, not even those who wear the robe of justice. Not just a voice, a foundation. That day, Judge Reyes didn't ask for punishment. He didn't demand revenge. He offered clarity. He offered direction. And most of all, he offered hope that even broken systems can be rebuilt from within, if only someone dares to speak with conviction and care. He didn't come to the round table to be heard. He came to remind everyone why they must never stop listening. The storm didn't begin with a protest. It didn't start with a press release or a courtroom outburst. It started with silence. The kind of silence that follows a collective realization, when the weight of truth settles across an entire institution like dust on old uniforms. When the very walls of the precinct seem to lean in, listening. Remembering. The precinct that once buzzed with routine activity now moved in stifled rhythms. Officers spoke more quietly. Conversations died in doorways. Keyboards clicked, but slower. The air was thick, not with fear, but with something heavier. Shame. The loop they couldn't escape. On every screen, in every office, the video played. Judge Malcolm Reyes. Calm. Composed. Respectful. His hands clearly visible. His voice level, almost painfully courteous. And still, the cuffs. Still, the forced compliance. Still, the image of a man whose dignity was mistaken for deceit, whose poise was read as defiance. In break rooms and locker areas, officers stood watching the footage loop again and again. Some looked away. Some watched it through narrowed eyes. Others simply stared, their faces unreadable. That's him. That's the judge they took in. The words were whispered like a confession. And for the first time in many careers, some officers felt the system look back at them with a question they weren't prepared to answer. What do you do when the person in the cuffs has spent his life defending the very laws you serve? The collapse of denial. In the past, there had always been room for excuses. We don't know the full context. He probably escalated it. This is just media spin. But not this time. This time, the man wasn't just a citizen, he was one of the system's own. A decorated judge with a flawless record. A man whose only error was stopping at the wrong rest stop in the wrong skin, wearing the wrong suit. And the evidence was airtight. Uncut. Unedited. Unforgiving. So, what do you do when the tape doesn't lie? You either look away, or you finally, painfully, start to look within. The precinct turns inward. Jeffers and Green had become names everyone knew. Not heroes. Not villains. Mirrors. Every officer saw something in them. Some saw a former academy partner who had been reckless. Others saw pieces of their own behavior, unconscious habits, subtle assumptions, silent complicity. For some, it was a moment of clarity. For others, a cracking open of long-ignored truths. The locker room banter dulled. The joke stopped. Even the veterans, hardened by years of us versus them mentality, began to shift uncomfortably in their chairs during morning briefings. Some cleared their throats when the video played. Others lowered their eyes. No one was laughing anymore. Because what had happened wasn't just a mistake, it was a symptom. The younger generation listens harder. At the State Academy, the incoming class watched the video in complete silence. There were no side conversations, no questions, only furrowed brows, clenched jaws, and notes scribbled faster than usual. One cadet, a woman from Grand Rapids, raised her hand afterward. If he hadn't been a judge, would this even be a story? The room went still. The instructor looked down. That was the moment many of them realized, it's not the system that protects people. It's visibility. Privilege. Title. Cameras. And not everyone gets those. So what happens to the ones who don't? That question became the weight in their boots as they walked the halls. It followed them to ethics seminars, training drills, and patrol simulations. It stayed with them, and that was new. Discipline and disbelief. In internal affairs, Officer Jeffers sat before a panel. His face was taut, jaw locked. But behind his eyes, the cockiness had cracked. He never said he was a judge, he muttered. He didn't act like one. The room did not flinch. A senior inspector leaned forward. And how, exactly, is a judge supposed to act while being unlawfully detained? Jeffers had no answer. And in that silence, even he realized, it didn't matter who the man was. The issue was why Jeffers had assumed what he did in the first place. And that's what the entire system was now being forced to ask. Across the state, the dominoes begin to fall. The ripples spread quickly. Departments began to review body cam footage from the past year. Reopen unresolved complaints involving traffic stops and profiling. Mandate de-escalation training led not by tactical units, but by community voices. In some cities, officers who had never spoken up about biased behavior in their units began sending anonymous letters. One captain, long considered a company man, called an emergency town hall with his precinct and said, "We're going to relearn what authority means. And it starts by admitting we've gotten it wrong, too often, for too long." It wasn't a revolution. But it was a reckoning. And reckonings, while painful, are necessary to begin the work of real reform. Pain as a path to purpose. For some officers, shame became a guide. A mirror. A hard truth that wouldn't let them sleep. And instead of deflecting it, they leaned in. One wrote a letter to Judge Reyes, not as a statement, but as a confession. "I've made assumptions that I never questioned until I saw how fast someone like you could be stripped of your humanity. I won't forget that. I won't let others forget either." Another turned in his badge, not out of anger, but clarity. "I wanted to protect people. That's not what I've been doing. And until I can, I need to step back." And many others, quietly, without announcements or headlines, changed the way they showed up, to calls, to communities, to themselves. From institutional shame to personal courage. True change doesn't begin in the streets. It begins in uncomfortable conversations. In long silences where denial used to sit. In the whispered apologies that grow into policies. In the humility to ask, "What if I'm part of the problem? And what can I do now, to be part of the solution?" The system was still flawed. But for once, it had stopped pretending otherwise. And in the aftermath of a man's quiet arrest, and even quieter dignity, an entire structure had been nudged awake by the tremor of its own conscience. Judge Reyes didn't seek to destroy the system. He held a mirror to it. And those who dared to look, truly look, began the slow, difficult, necessary work of turning shame into change. The courtroom was unchanged. Same wood-paneled walls, same rows of benches scarred by time and elbows, same quiet hum of ventilation carrying the scent of old books and newer nerves. The brass scales mounted above the judge's bench still gleamed, untouched by the storm outside. But when Judge Malcolm Reyes stepped into the chamber that morning, the air shifted. No announcement marked his return. No statement was issued. No public address or camera crew stood at the doors. He moved like he always had, quietly, precisely, without a flourish. But everyone noticed. Because while the room remained the same, he had changed everything by walking back in. A man who'd been seen. The bench had always carried weight. But now, it held something heavier. A kind of solemn authority born not of title or robe, but of experience. Lived. Survived. Endured. Everyone knew. Not officially, not through docket notes, but through whispers, headlines, and the video that had swept across the country like wildfire. The judge who had been arrested. The judge who never raised his voice. The judge who stood quietly, even as the law forgot who he was. And now he was back, not as a symbol of outrage, but as a man determined to administer the very justice that had failed him. How eyes changed. It started with the attorneys. The regulars who once treated the courtroom like a routine dance now hesitated before speaking. Their words were more carefully chosen. Their arguments, more grounded in conscience than cunning. They were no longer just arguing before a judge. They were presenting before a witness, one who had been profiled, cuffed, silenced, and returned without bitterness. The bailiff stood straighter. The stenographer typed with a different kind of focus. Even the defendants, some defiant, some weary, looked up with something rarely seen in the accused, respect not demanded, but earned. Because they had seen what the world had seen. And in Judge Reyes, they recognized someone who now carried not just the law, but the full weight of its fragility. The echo of that morning. He never mentioned it. Not once. Not in chambers, not in open court, not in passing. He did not wield his story as a weapon, nor lean on it for sympathy. He let it settle into the silence, the kind that gives gravity to every word that follows. But when officers testified before him, they measured their tone. When prosecutors described reasonable suspicion, they hesitated slightly, as if remembering what suspicion had once looked like, handcuffs and all. And when a young defendant asked, "Would it matter if I told you I didn't do it?" Judge Reyes paused. Longer than necessary. Not because he doubted the boy. But because he remembered. Justice, recalibrated. Before, he had been known as fair. Methodical. Temperate. Now, his justice felt different, sharper in clarity, but gentler in humanity. His rulings became moments of quiet instruction, not just for the guilty or the accused, but for the system watching itself through him. He began to thread words into his decisions that had not been part of the usual legal lexicon. Dignity. Humanity. Assumption. Repair. This courtroom, he said during one sentencing, does not exist to reinforce cycles. It exists to break them. That begins by seeing people, truly seeing them, before we decide what they deserve. He was not being poetic. He was being precise. Because justice, to him, was no longer a concept wrapped in statutes and tradition, it was something you could lose in under a minute, on the side of a highway, in broad daylight, wearing your best suit. A heavy robe, worn with resolve. What the public did not see was how he would sometimes sit a moment longer at the bench after court adjourned, the courtroom empty except for echoes and ghosts. He would stare at the empty seat where his own dignity had once been questioned. Not with anger. With resolve. There were nights he went home and reread opinions he had written years ago. He would find phrases that now felt insufficient, even blind. The words weren't wrong, but they had not been rooted in knowing. Now, he knew. He understood what it meant to be the one not believed. To be spoken over, to be told who you are, to have decades of service erased by a glance, a gesture, a gun belt thumbed too casually. And that knowledge became his compass. Justice is more than the verdict. He began to speak occasionally at law schools and judicial ethics seminars, not about his arrest, but about perception, power, and the invisible layers that press down on people before they ever enter a courtroom. You cannot rule justly over what you refuse to see clearly, he once told a room full of young lawyers. If bias isn't actively unlearned, it becomes the quiet foundation of every verdict. Some called him the conscience of the court. He refused the title. A conscience isn't something you add, he said. It's something you remember. The community comes back. Word spread through the city that Judge Reyes was different now. People who had long distrusted the courts began showing up, not for their cases, but to watch. To listen. To witness what it looked like when someone carried justice with humility. Former defendants sent letters. Some simply read. Thank you for not forgetting us. Thank you for showing them what justice looks like. They listened because you didn't raise your voice. And perhaps that was his greatest strength now. He didn't need to raise his voice. He had lived the verdict. He had worn the cuffs. And because of that, his silence now roared through the courtroom louder than any gavel strike ever could. What justice demands now? For Judge Malcolm Reyes, the law had not failed. People had. The system had bent not under pressure, but under its own refusal to reflect. So now, every day on the bench, he worked not to rewrite the law, but to restore its heart. Not to punish every mistake, but to ensure that no one, officer, attorney, or judge, ever mistook silence for submission again. He remained calm, steady, unwavering. But he had become something far more powerful than a jurist. He had become a living reminder that justice is not just about truth. It's about who gets to speak it, and who is finally willing to listen. The sun rose differently that morning, not brighter, not warmer, but quieter. As if the world itself had paused to consider what day it was, what it might mean, and who it was meant for. Outside the Michigan State Police Academy, the crisp air held no ceremony, no fanfare. Just the faint echo of leather boots crossing pavement and the hushed tones of young cadets filing into a room they had entered 100 times before, except this time, they were not coming to be trained. They were coming to be confronted. Not by drills or policy memos, but by truth. The room where reform begins. It was a sterile lecture hall, rows of plastic chairs, blank walls, a screen that had projected PowerPoint slides for years about appropriate use of force, probable cause, and non-lethal restraint. But today, that screen was off. The only thing that mattered stood in front of it, adjusting the microphone, not because it needed adjusting, but because some silences deserve preparation. Judge Malcolm Reyes stood there, not with a robe, not with a script, not with a courtroom behind him. He stood alone, holding only a leather folder and a gaze that had seen the very worst of what unchecked power could become, and still chose to return. The room didn't breathe. Because everyone already knew the story. They had seen the video. They had read the articles. They had listened to the ripple of shame that spread through the law enforcement community like a shockwave after the handcuffing of a sitting state judge. But now they were in the presence of that judge, not as a ghost from headlines, but as a man of flesh, memory, and unshakable dignity. The story they already knew, told differently. He didn't begin with anger. He didn't begin with blame. He began with a moment of stillness. I was detained without cause. I was searched without consent. I was denied my rights. And I am here today, not to accuse you, but to prepare you. The silence deepened. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace. He didn't need to dramatize anything. Because the weight of truth doesn't need volume. It just needs to be present. I am not here to talk about me, he continued. I am here to talk about what happens to people without a title, without a camera, without a phone call. I was let go. I was able to speak. I had the world behind me. They don't. Eyes began to shift. Arms folded in doubt began to uncross. Pens stopped scribbling notes and simply rested, waiting. Power that pauses is power that protects. Judge Reyes didn't talk about the law in terms of penal codes. He talked about conscience. He described the power in a badge, not as authority, but as a lens. A lens that, when unfocused, turns humanity into suspicion and dignity into danger. What if, he asked, instead of acting first, you paused for half a breath longer? What if you allowed one more second of recognition, one more inch of restraint, one more ounce of humility? Then he added, not with bitterness, but clarity. If that had happened to me, that day never would have made the news. But because it didn't, I'm standing in front of you. And I need to believe that means something. The conversation after the lecture. The applause never came, not because it wasn't earned, but because no one clapped in funerals. And for some of the cadets, what had just died was the version of policing they had once believed in. Afterward, Reyes sat alone on a bench outside the building, beneath a copper plaque that read, Honor. Discipline. Service. A few cadets came up one by one, not for selfies, not for validation, but because they couldn't walk away unchanged. A young woman with tears in her eyes simply whispered, Thank you for coming. My uncle died in custody. You gave me a reason to stay. A quiet man with a shaved head asked, How do I make sure I don't become the next Jeffers? Reyes didn't give them answers. He gave them questions to carry. Because that's how change begins, not with finality, but with friction that never quite lets you settle again. From one story, many seeds. Within weeks, word of the lecture spread, not virally this time, but organically, whispered in staff rooms, debated during training modules. A movement began, not on social media, but in memos, reforms, and rethinking. Bias response simulations were added to cadet evaluations. Restorative justice modules were taught alongside defensive tactics. Community panels were invited into graduation assessments to offer feedback, not on skill, but on perception and presence. Cadets were required to spend a week shadowing public defenders, to see how the system looked from the other side of the courtroom. And more importantly, cadets were asked, not forced, to write a personal reflection letter before graduation. What does power mean to you, now that you've worn it? What will you do with it the first time you're afraid? And who do you want to be, when no one is watching? Planting beyond the academy. Reyes never accepted full-time roles or titles from any oversight board. He declined interviews. He never let the moment define him. Because he believed true reform wasn't about his name, it was about what would remain when his name faded. He became a mentor to new judges. A quiet advisor to policy writers. A guest at town hall forums where he listened more than he spoke. But most often, he just showed up, at schools, at probation centers, at workshops, just to say, "You are not the worst thing that's happened to you. And this system is not the best version of itself yet. But we can fix both. Together." Legacy in the pause. Years later, a young officer would stop a car in a rural town, the driver nervous, the situation tense. And before asking questions, she'd take one deep breath and remember the man in the blue suit who told her to wait, just one moment longer, to see the person in front of her before reaching for suspicion. That one moment would change the outcome. The report would never be filed. The cuffs would remain holstered. And a person would go home, untouched, untraumatized, simply because someone remembered how to see. Final words, quietly sown. The system hadn't been healed. But somewhere beneath its machinery, new roots were taking hold. Not of perfection, but of possibility. And Judge Malcolm Reyes, who had once been stripped of his dignity in broad daylight, now walked with the knowledge that true dignity isn't restored by apologies. It is rebuilt through every choice that follows. He didn't call himself a reformer. He called himself a gardener. And before leaving the academy that final day, he turned one last time to the cadets and said, "If you remember nothing else, remember this. Justice is not the loudest voice in the room. It's the quietest one, the one that refuses to forget the weight of being misjudged." And with that, he left. Not triumphant. Not vindicated. But resolved. Because the most powerful systems are not built by strength. They are grown, seed by seed, by those who choose to believe that even after betrayal, justice can still rise. Sometimes, justice doesn't come with sirens or courtrooms. Sometimes, it walks quietly, handcuffed, misjudged, and humiliated, only to rise, stronger, clearer, and more determined. Judge Malcolm Reyes didn't just survive the system, he transformed it. Not with revenge. Not with rage. But with restraint, dignity, and the quiet courage to return, to plant better where trust had been uprooted. His story reminds us. Real change doesn't begin in the spotlight. It begins in the pause before a decision. In the voice that speaks when silence feels safer. So ask yourself. What kind of justice will you carry into the world? Because sometimes, the strongest stand is the one taken with calm, clarity, and conscience. Speech balloon. If this story moved you, share it. Movie Camera. Subscribe for more true stories that challenge, inspire, and awaken the human spirit. Seedling. This isn't just about what happened. It's about what happens next.